Constantinople, the Rome of the East, Istanbul. With its unique silhouette and structure that smells of history, it has always been one of the most important cities in the world since the first day it was founded. Topkapi Palace, Hagia Sophia, Maiden's Tower, Dolmabahche, Galata Tower, even though it resembles a concrete forest. History continues to spring from all over the city even today. And Istanbul will probably continue to preserve this feature for many years to come.
So, was Istanbul, or rather the place where Istanbul was founded, always so important? To find the answer to this question, we need to go back a few thousand years and look at things in certain stages.
When we dive into the dusty pages of ancient Anatolian history, we encounter more legends than history. The story of Istanbul begins with such a legend.
Between the 8th and 6th centuries BC, ancient Greek cities began to establish new colonies along the Mediterranean and Black Seas. Thanks to these colonies, they were both economically stronger and were able to establish new settlements for themselves. One of these city-states was the city of Megara, located in the Attica region of Greece.
Byzas, the king of the city-state of Megara, went to the Temple of Apollo in Delphi and consulted the oracle about the most suitable place for colonization before he set sail to establish a new colony. The oracle told him to proceed until he found the land of the blind. And when he found this country, he had to establish his colony in the lands opposite him. Byzas sails to the sea to find the place told by the oracle. Byzas and Megarians search for the described place in the waters of the Aegean. When they finally cross the Bosphorus and come to today's historical peninsula, namely to the Sultanahmet region, they see that there is a settlement called Kokdan in the region where Kadıköy is located on the Anatolian side. When the region they are standing on is such a beautiful one, it surprises everyone that people set up settlements on the opposite shore. They think that the people living on the other side are blind. What the oracle said came to mind, and they established a colony in this region. This colony was named Byzantium or Byzantium, after the king Byzas.
The legend is told in different ways in different records, and in many narratives, mythological characters are also involved. However, when it comes to written sources, we see that the first settlement in Istanbul was established by the Megarians in the 7th century BC. In fact, the historian Dionysius of Byzantium states that this date is exactly 658 BC. However, the archaeological data we have obtained today shows that the issue is not that simple. Studies carried out around Sarayburnu reveal that there is a small village-type settlement in the region dating back to about 6000 BC. So, if the Megarians established the first settlement here, what happened to the previous settlement? It is possible that people settled in this region thousands of years before the Megara colony was established. However, if we are to accept the version that the Megarians founded the city as correct, we must also accept that the oldest settlement in the area was already abandoned and destroyed. In this respect, we can say that the history of Istanbul actually goes back much further than Byzantium, but we do not have much data about this period. When we look at the history of Byzantium, we see that the importance of the city has increased and decreased from time to time. We know that the city took shape as a trade city due to its location at the entrance of the Black Sea. By expanding over time, it also captured Chokdan, that is, today's Kadıköy, across the Bosphorus. The city was taken by the Persian Empire during the Scythian campaign of King Darius I in 513 BC and was added to the administrative province of Scudra in the region. It is seen that the Persians did not attach much importance to Byzantium during this period, because the relationship of the Persians with Byzantium is not as stable as the relationship it established with other cities in the Thrace region. When we move the history a little further and come to the period of the Peloponnesian Wars, we see that the city gained importance again. In these years, Byzantium was the grain supplier of Athens, one of the most important city-states of the period. The Spartans, who were at war with Athens, took control of Byzantium in 411 BC in order to cut off the grain supply of the city during the siege of Athens. But this situation would not last long. When the Spartans began to withdraw from the areas they occupied in 408, the Athenian army entered the city and annexed Byzantium to its territory. The capture of the city by the Romans took place in AD 196 during the reign of Emperor Septimus Severus. The city, which was heavily damaged during the Roman siege, was rebuilt by the emperor, but lost its former importance and was connected to the city of Perinthus, where the Marmara Eregli is located today. It would take about 130 years from the Roman occupation for the city to gain its real importance. The 3rd century was a period of great crisis for the Roman Empire. From AD 235 onwards, Rome had faced many adversities such as internal turmoil, wars, famine, and diseases. There were frequent changes of emperors. The economy was almost in a collapsed state, and this caused great difficulties on the borders of the empire, both socially and militarily.
It is accepted that the crisis of the 3rd century ended with the accession of Emperor Diocletian on the 20th of November 284. Of course, Diocletian had to make many reforms in economic, social, and political fields in order to end this crisis process. At the beginning of the reforms made in the political field was the tetrarchy, that is, the 4-party system of government. According to this system, the Roman Empire would be ruled by 4 different emperors from 4 different centers.
2 of the emperors would take the title of Augustus as the upper emperor, while the other 2 would take the title of Caesar as the lower emperor. Diocletian himself had chosen the present city of Izmit, namely Nicomedia, as the capital and had a palace built here for himself. Maximian, another top emperor, preferred Milan as the capital. During this period, the empire had 4 different capitals: Nicomedia, Milan, Trier, and Sirmium. As you can see, Rome was no longer the capital of the empire. In fact, there was more than one reason for this situation to occur. First of all, Rome was defenseless. By the time of Diocletian, the city had been invaded several times and was on the verge of being invaded several times. In the process, after Diocletian, the city would be occupied many times. Emperors gradually began to favor more reliable cities in northern Italy, such as Milan and Ravenna, as their centers. The city of Rome retained its traditional and religious importance, and many ceremonies continued to be held here. However, the city had almost completely lost its administrative importance. Another factor was economic. In these years, the income from the mines in the west began to decline, and this caused the eastern provinces to become more important to the empire.
The main reason why the top emperor, Diocletian, moved his capital to the east was related to foreign policy. One of the most powerful and oldest enemies of the empire was the Sassanid state. The simplest way to deal with Persia more effectively was to shift the center of the empire to the east. This center had become Nicomedia for Diocletian. However, Constantine, who reigned after him, would build his own city. And this city would be named after him, Constantinople.
The third stage began with the establishment of a new city by Emperor Constantine. When the Byzantine defense system was well designed, it was an easily defended settlement. Considering the weaknesses of Rome, the capital of the empire, in terms of defense, this was a very important advantage. The long siege of the triangular peninsula from the sea was not possible due to the strong currents on the Bosphorus side and the periodic lodo storms on the Marmara side.
If the entrance to the Golden Horn was also closed with a chain, the city could only be surrounded from one side of the triangle, namely the land, which would not have been a siege in the full sense of the word. A strong fortification system to be built on the land side would make the city unbeatable. Constantine, who was well aware of the security problems of the western lands of the empire and the capital of Rome, saw this extraordinary defense advantage.
The city that could not be conquered for 11 centuries justified his view. These walls would only be overcome when a new technology was developed. That is, cannons strong enough to break these walls from a relative distance could be made.
The rebuilding of Byzantium began in 324, and it took 6 years for the city to turn into Constantinople. During this time, the old walls of Byzantium were destroyed. The city was expanded, divided into 14 different parts, and the new city was surrounded by stronger walls.
However, despite all this, Constantine's work was not finished yet. When a new city was built, it was necessary to revive the population of this city. The political machinery of the empire was still in Italy, and Byzantium had a low population compared to other cities of the empire. Constantine needed to make his new city more attractive. For this, first of all, works of art in important cities of the empire such as Rome, Antioch, and Alexandria were moved to the new capital.
New buildings were also being built. Around 40,000 Gothic workers brought from the north of the Black Sea were working in the construction of the city. The famous hippodrome, built by the Emperor Septimus Severus, who annexed Byzantium to Roman territory, was expanded and its capacity was increased to 80,000 people. New temples were built and streets lined with statues of famous figures from Greek and Roman history, such as Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar.
What the sprawling city would need most was water. For this, Constantine had a cistern, one of the oldest water sources in Istanbul, built. The city was consecrated with a formal ceremony on May 11, 330, thus officially establishing Nova Roma. But building magnificent structures was not enough to increase the population of this new city in a short time. The new Rome had to be made more attractive to everyone. For this, aid policies such as free grain aid and free bread distribution were implemented to attract many people, from farmers to traders, from craftsmen to artists, to this new city. For example, in 332, 117 distribution points were established in different parts of the city, and around 80,000 breads were distributed daily from these points. Such policies eventually led to the migration of people from the surrounding regions to Constantinople. The next step was to bring the new city out of the shadow of the centers in Italy, politically and administratively. For this, important statesmen had to be persuaded to settle in Constantinople. Most of the senators continued to reside in Rome. because many of them had properties and lands here. Constantine offered to distribute many of the lands around Constantinople to them in order to attract them to his new city.
This plan enabled some politicians to settle in Constantinople in the short term, but it would take at least another 50 years for the new Rome to reach the power of the old politically. The empire now had a new capital, and this had enormous historical consequences. So, what were they? Now, let's try to analyze these consequences briefly.
The fourth stage is about the changes introduced by Constantinople. Since its establishment as a city-state in 753 BC, Rome's main language was Latin. The official language of the empire was Latin. Emperors and Roman people spoke Latin. In many parts of Europe, Latin had become the dominant correspondence language, and this influence would continue throughout the Middle Ages. But the eastern part of the empire was under the influence of the Greeks. The language of the people in the region was Greek.
Although the emperors continued to speak and write in Latin for a while, the language of the empire changed to Greek in time, and Greek was declared the official language of the empire in 610 AD.
The only change that occurred was not in the language. Culturally, there was an intense change. The advisors and teachers of the emperors were not Romans as before, but people of Greek origin. At this point, many ideas and thoughts that developed in the East began to spread to the imperial institutions.
In the West, emperors were defined by the Latin concept of princeps, meaning first citizen. His position was generally considered first among equals. According to this tradition, all Roman citizens were equal. The emperor was one of them, but he had higher powers. This made him the first citizen among equals.
On the other hand, there was the concept of divine ruler in the East. Persian rulers, for example, were viewed as sacred and often inaccessible. The Eastern emperors looked for ways to adapt this concept to their benefit. The further spread of Christianity did not change things for them. Modesty that was preached by the Christian religion was not very interesting for the emperors who looked for new ways to consolidate their rule.
Under their rule, the idea of divine ruler turned into the idea that the ruler on earth is the representative of the divine ruler in heaven. We can explain the difference between the understanding of empire in the East and the traditional understanding of empire in the West with an example. Ancient emperors residing in Rome were often people who were close to the people. They would walk to the Senate and not have many bodyguards with them. However, after the center of the empire shifted to the East, emperors began to be seen as more sacred beings. Yes, in Rome, traditionally, emperors could be deified. However, this was usually an honorary rank conferred by the Senate after the emperor died. In Eastern Rome, the emperors had become inaccessible people while they were still alive.
Acceptance ceremonies and official ceremonies began to be held much more comprehensively and closed to the public. In the West, the emperors usually lived in their villas, while in the East, magnificent palaces were built. If the emperor was to appear before the people, he had to be in a high place and away from the people. In short, after the center of the empire became Constantinople, the empire was elevated to a much more sacred level.
When Emperor Constantine died in 337 AD, the new city was named Constantinople in his honor, meaning the city of Constantine. From the moment it was founded, Constantinople was the capital of Eastern Rome for more than 1,000 years, excluding the approximately 50 years of rule of the Latin kingdom founded by the Crusaders. After the Ottoman conquest in 1453, It served as the capital of another empire for 470 years. Istanbul was the capital of empires. During this time, it has always been one of the most important cities in the world and has become a historical landmark and cultural center in its own right. It has seen looting, wars, fires, and earthquakes over the years. It has been damaged many times, but it has survived no matter what.